Welcome to NeuroNoodle's Neurofeedback Neuropsychology Podcast featuring tech legend Jay Gunkelman. He is the man who has read well over 500,000 brain scans. Our goal is to provide information and promote options for better mental health. The NeuroNoodle Podcast is supported by listeners and businesses just like you, like our gold supporter, the 7th Annual Super Brain Summit at Bradley University, and our silver supporter, Mind Media. Join us at the 7th Annual Super Brain Summit at Bradley University Center for Collaborative Brain Research. It's featuring speaker Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. She's the author of The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Our Love and Loss. If you want to get more information regarding registration, contact Gwen Hoarter. She's at GHOWARTER at bradley.edu or call her at 309-677-3900. If you want more information regarding programming, you can contact Dr. Lori Russell Chapin herself at 309-677-3186 or email lar@bradley.edu. Mindmedia.com. Get the latest EEG and neurofeedback technology from mindmedia.com. Their semi-dry sensor cap is a wonder to see, and their EEG amplifiers have been trusted in the field for decades. Their neurofeedback and QEEG courses will get you up to speed in no time. Visit mindmedia.com now.
Not Dr. J.
What's that?
Not Dr. J.
Not Dr. J? Oh, that's true.
Yeah. Tech J.
I forgot.
Oh, come on. If Dr. J can play basketball and be called doctor,
It's true.
Jay Gunkelman has read a gazillion brain scans.
No, but I have to be correcting that. You can see the problem if there was a misunderstanding about it.
Yeah, I have to do the same thing with regards to clinical stuff. Folks often want me to use diagnostic language, or they want to understand that, and I'm sort of, it's part of our the way we educate, the way we frame what we do, our value proposition for our clients is providing education and agency, not diagnostic expertise. So I joke that when our clients find us, we teach them to become experts instead of having to be the right expert, the next person who has the answer. We can transfer some of that to them so they can, go forward with it.
I've always had the luxury of working along with a neurologist or electroencephalographers typically. And that's been very freeing, obviously. You can call something what it is and not have to kind of work around. And a diagnostic call with the credential as a cosign. So it worked really well for me.
Can I ask though, to what extent did you've been doing EEG, clinically, EEG is a clinical field. How long have you been involved with EEG?
Well, I had my first laboratory in 1972.
So almost as long as I've been alive, you've been picking up brain signals professionally.
But I played around with EEG amps and stuff at university, at the North Dakota State University in Fargo. Go Bison, if you don't want to know. But the state hospital in Jamestown basically gave us space and funding, and we built our own amps. 1972, what neurofeedback amp could you buy?
Yeah.
How big was it?
The Autogen had a zero cross detector, which couldn't see anything but the dominant frequency. It was a terrible amp. It had enough space inside the case to carry lunch, but but you couldn't really do real EEG with it. And the state hospital had a big old brass Model 6, which wasn't like current, but it was still quite functional. So we had some interesting times. 3 years I ran that lab, and then came out to California. And then I, after 1 year of making equipment and finding that you could go broke making equipment for people
fast,
I decided that the service end of the field always has need for service. So I got a job in the busiest EEG lab in the world in San Francisco, and over 100 a day. A minimum day was 100 EEGs.
Wow.
And they came in from over 400 hospitals across the U.S. off of satellite and through phone systems. And so
wow.
500,000 EEGs later, that's calculating only 100 a day. And there were days we topped 200, but
sure,
just 100 a day makes for an easy calculation. So, so I had that as a background. A BS degree from North Dakota State University, where they know a lot about BS, so
well versed.
But just basically the depth of visual exposure to the waveforms and training with John Hughes and the Gibbs and Charlie Yeager and Dr. Shear, and they're very, very high level EEG interpretation and high, density of exposure. Yeah. I remember an email chat list online, which I had to kind of step away from those because I wouldn't let go of some conversations that didn't make sense. So
there's some vitriol in those old news groups.
And at that point, I just that wasn't me, so I just had to just quit doing that. I remember somebody with an email, something about a salamander.
Oh, that was probably me. Yeah. I was very vocal on those early lists.
You interchanged with me and asked about grad schools where you could do a neurofeedback program without getting kicked out of the university, and I suggested Eran Zaidel at UCLA, brain lateralization lab. Yep. So I remember you back before you were the you that you are now.
That's right. 30 years, a while ago. I forget exactly when that was.
I could tell you a sharp guy on the email list. You were also one to try to drill down and ask the kind of the show me the data sort of approach to some of the posts. So
well, I mean, back then there was I really described that time in the field of neurofeedback as a bunch of blind men and elephants. Everyone's describing something and proclaiming truth about Mars is the way and being in direct yours can't work. This is how to do neurofeedback. This is how it works. People arguing back then about, does sight on the head matter? Does frequency matter? This is why part of my dissertation work was to compare sights and frequencies, active and sham, to just like put a stake in that question once and for all. Yes, it matters. Here it is. It's proven. But
and Eran Zaidel's brain lateralization lab is the perfect spot to have done.
Where
dichotic listening tests and things that were available for analysis that normal labs don't think like that, so
it also dovetailed. I mean, I was trained to do neurofeedback before grad school by Dr. Larry Hirshberg in Providence.
I know Larry.
Great in the field, recently retired, but Larry had a big long history focused on developmental trajectory stuff, autism and other types of developmental stuff with kids primarily. And I was Dr. Hirshberg was trained in this sort of arousal model of neurofeedback that sort of, I think, came out of my perspective, sort of from the Othmers initially and some of that EEG, it was called neurocybernetics, sort of
beta SMR,
right? The arousal model. And when I took the arousal model, which was heavily relevant to spectrum development and kids and ADHD and things, when I took that, and then I went into a laterality lab, and I got my head around, unintended, laterality and left and right. And I started to think about how we use, beta in the left and SMR on the right, and frequency specific hemisphere differences. And some of the clinical lore, the rules, the paintbrushes we've been taught to use started to coalesce. So I really, I sat through, I also had the luxury of sitting through, I'm going to say it's a luxury that I did it twice, but I took the course twice with Arnie Scheibel on neuroanatomy. Because I didn't pass the first time. It was really hard, medical student level neuroanatomy. And I went through it and almost, got it and didn't quite get it and did it again. And really it sunk in. But the mix of that like old school arousal model, the laterality model that Dr. Zaidel helped really instill. I mean, a lot of the tools that I used in my research on brains in general, on neurofeedback, I use something called the LANT, the Lateralized Attention Network Task, which is a lateralized version of Mike Posner's attention network task. So it's a flanker task. You're trying to predict the direction of an arrow, say it's up or down or left or right, and there's some flankers, some distractors nearby. Trying to predict something or judge something with distractors that are incongruent to it or in conflict to it creates an executive conflict, which is a sort of prefrontal kind of thing. And Dr. Zaidel took Posner's ANT, which was a horizontal line of arrows, flipped it vertically, made it in both hemispheres, and then made it a tactistoscope, so a very rapid presentation. And you can constrain the response hand by visual field, and now you can actually test attention systems in each hemisphere separately. Okay. So I started to think about the brain very differently once I got the ability to dig in and test modular resources. And, this was dovetailing with, I was working, of course, a little bit in that lab with Dr. Jack Johnstone, dear friend of both of ours who passed on a few years ago. Also a great EEG.
Yeah, my business partner back then. Yeah.
And so Jack was teaching me a lot about this sort of endophenotype perspective on brains and EEG. And, I was learning to read.
That was obviously our
That was you
publication.
and Jack and Joy, right? That first paper, I think. Yeah. 2005, endophenotype clinical characterization of clinical databases.
Yeah. I was talking about failure modes in the brain that were common, but we hadn't put together that they were probably endophenotypic until 2005. But for about 4 or 5 years before that, I had done the reverse look at the 500,000 or what I could recall of them. I don't have the artificial intelligence. I just have this old skin version, So, but having looked at that, these were the common patterns that I saw. And having hung out in clinical settings, what were the treatments that matched up with them? Because if you had the same endophenotype, you got the same treatment approach. The DSM didn't make any freaking sense. Obviously it's not valid anyway. So we didn't really drive ourselves for treatment decisions based on the DSM. We used the EEG to guide us, and cutting across the DSM, if you had the same EEG pattern, you got the same treatment basically. So that's what we published in the 2005 with the insight that it was likely endophenotypic. There were 2 of the 11 patterns that were known genetic correlates. Since then, obviously, the others have been filled in. So it wasn't a bad guess,
It absolutely wasn't. And I mean, I struggle with endophenotypes, the phenotypes in general, as a thing that I work with every single day. And this is sort of getting to something I started to ask a minute ago. 50 plus years working with EEG, I assume most of that, almost all of that, is with the lens, with the perspective of clinical pathology, atypicality, problems being presented. When I look at endophenotypes, patterns that exist in the EEG across people, I find there are phenotypes that exist that aren't the clinical ones necessarily.
Yeah. In fact, a phenotype, the proportionality of the phenotype's expression is whether you're normal or clinical. Each phenotype, the phenotypes exist in normal people and clinical people, the same phenotypes. It's just more severely expressed, and that it's an easy. You reduce the proportionality of the Mahalanobis distance of the 3-dimensional data scatter and multivariate analysis. So if you have less divergence, you're normal. If you have more divergence within that pattern, you're clinical. And that's an easy one to show.
But that sort of opens the door for us here, right? Because we all have brains that are weird. Good job. Be weird. Like all of us are rather atypical. And when you show someone their atypicality, their endophenotypes, their anterior cingulate being extra hot, could be perseverative and intrusive and obsessive, or it could be that they're a highly effective CEO who's highly organized and loves their mind. Or the back midline could be a trauma response, or it could be a very effective lifeguard who's heavily skilled at it and doesn't seem to be threatened or activated by their threat response stuff. So that I struggle with day to day, because I work with clients with acute clinical classic stuff, and I work with clients that are the highest performers, squeezing the juice out of life and everything in between. And I find the same patterns in a person that walks in with no problems, as well as somebody who's got severe dysregulation. And it's not a question of here's a thing that's wrong with you. Here's a thing that's different in you. Would you like to work on it? Does it make sense to you? Is it valid? Because trying to interpret phenotypes, yes, the electricity pattern, the thing we can measure, the statistical thing that's hard to, measure, clean away in some ways, still sticks up. Those things don't always mean interesting things for each person.
A deviation could be abnormal. Could be a compensatory mechanism, and it could be a unique outlier state that the person has as a special skill.
Yeah.
And Gerard Finnemore in South Africa is a brilliant guy. I've known him for a long, long time. I won't embarrass him the number, but he works with what you would consider extreme athletes. Who runs those things that you run over 2 mountain ranges for 6 days, or those crazy races. Who rows across the freaking Atlantic in a boat by themselves? These are his clients.
Yeah, I have some of those too.
Yeah. And don't you know that they have a cingulate that's just crazy?
A lot of them.
If they didn't, how the hell would they stay on task for those?
Dr. Hill, I'm going to put a link to I'm going to put a link right here to the last show that we did with you about a couple of years ago. What has gone on with you since then? I see that you're opening up new locations. I see you have a moniker, the Magic Man, and you have some
podcaster. That was her. That was her experience, her judgment after working through it. I mean, a lot of people have this experience of getting agency, of understanding themselves a lot more after digging into looking at themselves. And that's what people find magical. And this is also my sort of frustration with the field of neurofeedback. It's all rather magical, and none of it's any really more mysterious than anything else. There is no magic box in neurofeedback. There is no best particular approach. There's understanding of the science and the physiology and gentle shaping and moving it, but nobody has like the magic. Like there's no mystery tradition here that you have to be initiated into to really start digging in, and only the right particular church will get it to you. It's not how this stuff exists. So we've been expanding Peak Brain Institute, which is really focused on a mix of classic neurofeedback and peak performance stuff. We have 4 offices now in the US, and we're opening up as well in Europe. So in the US, we have New York City, which just expanded, St. Louis, LA, and Orange County, California, each have offices. And then we're in London now too. So Stockholm.
How do you keep control of all of that?
Well, I have a perspective on brain training that is not a therapist. I mean, a lot of my colleagues, my mentors, people have taught me, they're mostly therapists, and they tend to have a roster of clients, of patients that are 20 clients, 30 clients, and they see them for a mix of therapy and neurofeedback typically. And almost everyone I know in the field has a population of interest because they started off doing autism or eating disorders or anxiety or trauma, and then discovered neurofeedback as a lovely tool set, or they started to specialize because of the change they could help shepherd in a particular area. They really found it fulfilling. I don't do that piece of it. I don't narrowly niche down, and I also don't work in the role of a therapist for you. So without being a therapist, without working to have to create the complete transference container, that safety container where you're sort of allowing a therapist to create some agency and re-examine things and provide a mixed perspective that is the therapeutic process to sort of unlearn and relearn things. That's a pretty vulnerable place to be. And it takes a lot of management of clinical boundaries. And there is this transference, this relationship you develop with the person and their agency. And Peak Brain instead operates like a bunch of personal trainers and coaches. We're here to thrust agency back upon you and teach you how your brain works. So, we see about 10 times as many clients, I think, as the average neurofeedback solo practitioner. And we do that because I teach people to read their brain maps. We don't write these long, exhaustive, here's a bunch of labels and here's things that could be true about you, diagnostic level reports. We instead say, oh, cool, data, CPT, brain maps. Let's dig in. Let's look at some stuff. Let's teach you the neurocognitive exercise of putting physiology, behavior in contrast and seeing what's outlined about your resources and teach you how this stuff works. And okay, there's your brain. What do you want to do? And so we can take the stuff that is clinical when it exists, executive function stuff, anxiety features, sleep, post-COVID brain fog, seizures, migraines, whatever. And you can work on those things from a resource perspective. If I talk to you about your anterior cingulate and its tendency perhaps to perseverate being plausible based on your maps, and you're like, oh my God, yes. Actually, somebody gave me an OCD diagnosis. Oh, wow, I'm sorry you deal with that. It's so annoying. Here's the physiology probably. Would you like to work on that? So, I don't have to deny other people's diagnostic language, but I don't really care if you're a high-powered CEO who's mostly good at hyper-focusing, but can't turn it off and be nice to your partner when you get home, or if you're like somebody who's compulsively hand-washing, or somebody who just has a song stuck in your head. If you tend to perseverate and the anterior cingulate is stuck for you, well, that's true for you. You know how you feel. So you can now learn the physiology, take control of it. And that thrusting of agency, that educational, that piercing that mystery a little bit by showing someone their brain map, I think really helps to offload in some ways some of the burden of doing neurofeedback traditionally. I mean, a lot of therapists struggle to continue to maintain a perspective on how their clients' brains are changing. Clients aren't super compliant with sleep surveys and personal inventories and things day to day. And you've spent a lot of time catching up on that, sort of a bug of neurofeedback. And we made it a feature. We teach you to do neurofeedback if you're a client. I mean, about 80% of our clients work from home with equipment, and we just teach you to do it. We have live support staff and live coaches to jump on and help you and teach you and suggest new things. But the big benefit, even before folks do neurofeedback with us, especially if you're near an office, is that we provide this sort of membership model for brain mapping. So people pay one time and they come throughout the year and learn to use mapping and attention testing as a tool. So I'm in California with offices in New York. Cannabis is legal in those states. And I can't tell you the number of maps I've seen pre and post cannabis or Adderall or caffeine or biohackers, looking at their different nootropic stacks, examining how their cognitive stuff works, or folks that have gotten COVID and have post-COVID examining the degree of brain fog or the post-concussion stuff that got reactivated by their new ski trip. When you can see this stuff and you can see it shift in numbers and you can relate it to how you're feeling, you can start shifting your relationship with aspects of suffering and places where you aren't performing. You can be as annoyed and as frustrated as you want to be looking at a broken shoulder on an x-ray. You're probably not going to be ashamed or overwhelmed quite the same way when you're like, oh my God, that thing, it's so annoying. Yeah, don't tolerate it. Oh, empathy, frustrating. But it's just your brain in this case. You can see it, you can change it. And I tell people that, look, if you see stuff on a QEEG, QEEGs are hard to interpret a little bit. People are weird. But if you see something that is valid for you, great. Because you can almost always change something in a data set. Of course, it only matters to you if it's valid, if it really matters to you. But, if you see it, you have agency. So that's sort of our soapbox. And that, with the network of physical offices, we also do remote programs, is creating a different relationship, I think, with the field of neurofeedback. Because a lot of our clients are not just doing, I got to fix something, but they're learning to understand themselves and moving through even years sometimes of mapping progressively, trying different life interventions, doing some neurofeedback, and transforming across a long time, hopefully. So
Artificial intelligence, is that coming into play? The Chat GPT? Jay and I have been going back and forth over the last couple of weeks. Jay's a big proponent of AI.
Oh yeah, it's gonna. I mean, we've just discovered fire. I don't think we quite know yet what it can do. All we know is it can burn things. We don't know yet it can cook gourmet meals. Like we're at that level. Oh my God, someone got burned. Yeah, but Peking duck. Like there's a whole other end of the use of the technology we have to get to as it elaborates. Of course, the big constraint here is that these, especially natural language model or deep language model systems, are only really good when they are constrained very, very narrowly in the questions and are trained on a very narrow data set. So to get them to do the skilled stuff we do is going to take a minute, because the amount of judgments you have to capture and then train the system on, and the amount of data sets you have to provide for the subsequent training are a little bit, there's some stuff that has to happen first. But I've got a database of 5,000 clients, more. I forget when I put the new charting system in that I last used, but it captures peak brain. The current entity has been around for 7.5 years. Like I have 6 years of decision making captured. Every protocol, all the surveys, every attention test, every brain map in this massive data set. Now, if I can figure out how to constrain Chat GPT 4 or 5, whatever, Auto GPT, I can sort of say, look, here's the questions we want to ask. Here's the ways we've answered in the past. I think going back to the old school machine learning of training models, model fitting, that's going to come together with the amazing natural language stuff and the inferential reasoning and the genetic learning, where you can tell it to learn to do stuff and give it very imprecise and have it do federated GPTs where it sends other GPTs out to do stuff. Amazing. But we're going to need the other piece of it, which is the old school machine learning model fitting the learning and intelligence against the domain expertise we already have. You can't take domain expertise and put it in these models. That's the big issue. But we're developing that.
Do you think that your look, ChatGPT is open source, okay? Could there be an open source? I know there's a few people that are doing it, but all the scans that you do, you take the identifiers off and you put it in one place and everybody has access to it. Do you think we can be organized to figure out where somebody doesn't? I know everybody wants to make a profit. Everybody wants to be proprietary, but 500,000 is bigger than 5,000, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, sure. Although I bet Jay would agree, you don't need 500,000 to approach normal variability. You need about 10 to 100,000, depending on what you're looking at. So, sure, absolutely. And we're doing that basic science question thing you're asking. That's asking about science, about how brains work. That's useful. But I think the exciting thing is the next step. And that's the intelligent agent that is a model of you that interacts with interventions.
You probably would need somewhere around 500,000.
Do you think, to approach a wild type?
You don't need it as one group. You need it randomized into two groups so that you can validate what you find in one group independently on the second group. Yeah. Without that validation step, you could be up a box canyon and not be aware of it. So one of the difficulties in neuroscience is replicability.
Yeah,
and we've got to provide that. You're right, about 100, maybe 200,000, something such as that, may be sufficient to generally characterize the broad distribution, but categorization within that as clinical categorization, epilepsy, bipolar, the clinical observations, some of which are quite valid, and the epilepsy spectrum is, I think, a concept that needs to be included, because autism and ADD and the high percentage of epileptiform content that you see in these clinical groups. So a few 100,000 can characterize the normal distribution fairly well, but the clinical clusters are going to have to be identified. That's some hand-holding of the algorithm, some management, basically. But once
What
you've
if we
got that done,
proposed?
once
Yeah.
you've got that done one time, you have to run that on your independent sample and validate it basically.
Yeah.
Join us at the 7th Annual Super Brain Summit at Bradley University Center for Collaborative Brain Research. It's featuring speaker Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. She's the author of The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Our Love and Loss. If you want to get more information regarding registration, contact Gwen Hoarter. She's at GHOWARTER at bradley.edu or call her at 309-677-3900. If you want more information regarding programming, you can contact Dr. Lori Russell Chapin herself at 309-677-3186 or email lar@bradley.edu.
One of the ideas I have around that, and part of where I'm getting my 10,000 to 100,000 number from, is I think we can take the data model, the conceptual model of QEEG, and make it add a dimension of time into it. So if we had wellness trackers for the brain, where some people are tracking their sleep, their stress, their seizures, their migraines, their mood, how angry their mother-in-law made them, whatever, their drinking, their exercise, and we have a longitudinal set of variability per person with some snapshots against their normal variability within one person. Now QEEG has a different metric. And I believe that amount of intra-individual variability captured with context will take that number of 200,000 and cut it down to, I think the power analysis will show that it's like 20,000 now in terms of wild type, because you're getting the seizure incidence that happens every so often across 6 weeks. You're getting the recurrent migraine patterns, and there's going to be a lot more contextual data. I think we will be able to reduce the need to keep QEEGs clean. I want someone to walk in, sit down, do a brain map, walk out, and okay, they reported having caffeine before and they smoked weed last night. Oh, and they have some sort of like, bis and bas spectrum, some sort of anxiety stuff they're reporting. Okay, great. So now with this atypical characterization, now we can have a sort of regression mean through a set of normal typical data or examine the variance around human populations, but with the context of how people themselves vary, which is a thing we actually have to sort of control out in QEEG. Come in the morning, no caffeine, not super tight. There's a bunch of constraints to get valid EEG data now, and I think we're going to be able to eliminate those at some point and have fatigued and stressed and medicated EEG and be able to look right through that and make judgments. I think that's coming.
How do we get more data? If you have 5,000, we need 100,000, whatever the number is. Do you think it's possible to get everybody together and say, all right, we'll spend $600 like Stanford, make our own AI?
Sure.
And who
sure.
do we get together?
I'm sure someone's already doing it.
Yeah.
Again, the thing that I'm much more interested in is the next step.
Aitken at Stanford actually separated from Stanford into a private entity that was funded. And they're doing an AI scrubbing, trying to replace psychiatry with, biomarkers. And Stanford gave them 37,000 EEGs that were already cleaned up and digitized. And the problem was that these are all epilepsy cases and encephalopathy cases, because that's what you use the EEG for clinically. The data is not sufficient to characterize psychiatry.
This is what I'm saying. We need to think about brains as normal variability, and we need to all be examining our brains just like we look at our lipid panels. It's just a part of your physiology that you manage. It's not so much about pathology is my take on it, but
you're right. Well, blood pressure. I mean, I just got back from my physical. It's like, here's the baseline. How do you compare over the years? People have to get in that frame of mind, pardon the pun, that, above your neck, you have to keep an eye on what's going on there as well.
Yeah, and you can't feel it, ironically. So,
well, insurance doesn't pay. That's
I don't even let them test me anymore.
Really?
People that are on steroids and stuff. So,
oh yeah, right.
Show me a norm that I'm appropriate for, So, yeah.
But wouldn't you find it useful? Like if you had a data point that was distorted by your experience, your suffering, some medication, et cetera, you would understand how that data point being distorted, what it meant. Like it would provide agency for you as somebody who's educated, can interpret subtle data. why don't we all have that capability of,
There's a reason that I've lasted over 30 years and they have an average life expectancy of less than 10 for no pituitary. And
what's the reason?
It's difficult to stay alive with no pituitary. I'll tell you that. I didn't hear.
Both anterior and posterior pituitary?
Yeah, the whole thing's gone.
Wow. So your brain has very poor timing, very poor.
I get a new doctor and they have a clean clipboard, nothing on it, and Mr. They joke on the last name. What are you here for? Well, renew my meds. Well, what are you on? I start to list my meds, and about 5 meds down the list, they say, well, what do you have? And I say, it's not what I have, it's what I don't have. I don't have a pituitary. And the clipboard and the jaw drop at about the same time. They're linked together somehow, some reflex. I don't know what it is. But what do we do for you? Well, renew my meds. And you might want to find a specialist who might know what to do for me. But they don't really exist. A neuroendocrinologist, and neuroendocrinologists that are able to do better than what I've been doing don't exist. So that doing what they do, you have a half a chance of living 10 years, so.
Well, I can imagine there's a large practice space for those doctors to operate in this particular complaint. So,
I take my medications essentially all PRN, and these are not meds that are prescribed PRN, steroids and stuff.
Yeah.
But I was complying perfectly with the prescriptions, and they couldn't get normal blood levels. And I told them, well, let me take them the way I want, and I give you normal blood levels. They said, well, there's no way for you to tell your cortisol level, hydrocortisone, steroids that you're eating. I said, well, yes, there is. I've damaged myself over the years. I cut these fingers off and had them sewn back on. I've got a wrist that's had 6 surgeries, got bad knees, broken back twice, busted up ribs. I'm a total freaking mess. When I feel pain in all of those, I'm not on enough steroids.
Yeah, inflammatory stuff, yeah.
And if I can't feel any of them, now I have earned the right to feel some pain. So if I can't feel any of them, I'm on too much steroid. And I don't have a normal life. I used to fly internationally, or I was sitting at home on the computer for 3-4 weeks at a time. So I didn't have a normal lifestyle. And here you are, your pituitary, if you change the level of life stress, shifts the levels around, the cortisol level will shift based on what's needed as an anti-inflammatory for yourself, and to control your immune system.
And blood sugar and circadian and
and with you could slam it with doses a couple of times a day. Standard doses didn't match up with a non-standard life. So as soon as I started taking in PRN, I gave them normal blood levels, and they couldn't understand. They basically said, "Okay, take it however you want, but don't tell anybody." I've made it 30 years and way past any estimate that they would have given me. So,
well, we're super glad you've been continuing to share your Janus with us all. So
I'm still having too much fun to pass. That's all.
That's great.
The devil doesn't want you. So, Dr. Hill, I hear you got some new podcast episodes coming up. What you got cooking?
Yeah, we have some new podcast episodes. I had a podcast called Head First with Dr. Hill that's available on all the podcast places, Apple and YouTube, etc.
We'll put it
you'll put a link in the corner. Great. And Head First, we sort of went fallow during the pandemic. We reduced we changed our office a lot. Pre-pandemic, we were sort of this really vibrant 7-day a week, 12-hour a day gym with a couple locations, and now we are more locations, but they're smaller, and 80% of our clients work from home. So it's got this very different kind of phenomena attached to it in terms of how clients work with us. But as we're starting to do more with meditation groups and client outreach and stitching together this worldwide network of both gyms and clients, we're relaunching podcasts and things like that. So head first to Dr. Hill will be, I think the new episodes will start rolling out next month. We have a couple of big guests. I think Wim Hof is one of our first guests coming out as a show we're producing right now. And I think it'll be a weekly podcast.
Okay.
Pushed to all the podcast places. So folks, please subscribe. You can check me out at Andrew Hill, PhD. You can check out Peak Brain at Peak Brain LA. And I think my YouTube is just Dr. Hill, DrHill. So come check us out.
What are people wanting to consume nowadays? What do they want to know?
Yeah. I find the stuff that people want to know is always very, personal, and it tends to constellate around the same types of phenomena. I mean, this is sort of getting back to the idea that if we understand ourselves, we can take more control. I mean, Jay has a strategy with managing his cortisol that works for him because he understands it adequately, and he manages better than most people, better than doctors do in this instance. And I find people, when they understand that their alpha waves are running slow, and that's why they have word finding issues. It's probably not aging at 55. Oh, your alpha speeds are all over the place, and your deltas, you're not sleeping great, and you're having speed of processing. So they often go, oh, okay, wait a minute, that's happening. So when we start to distill things down to how some individual person's brain works, not just like the phenotypes cohere in the data sets from our scientific and clinical perspective, but the experiences start to cohere for individuals. They start understanding how their sleep management or lack thereof is impacting them, or their eating before bed is impacting them, or their working night shift throws them off, or their, ski vacations they keep getting concussed on. I find people start to really become laser focused on stuff that they sort of already know, but becomes this, how do I change that? How do I make change? Can I go after that? I also find people are often a little bit scared until they realize that brain mapping is this tool. They're often like, I don't want to know. I can't, but well, you can change it. Oh, I can change it. Okay, I want to know. So people generally want to know whatever it is they suffer from the most. Sleep, stress, or attention are often big foundational things that they're curious about. Oh, I'm different. I'm unique in this way. Can you help me take control of it? Is often how people lead their investigations. So
your model is a bit unique in that you've got coaching and general health and wellness orientation, and kind of an eclectic set of tools, hyperbaric and various diet and lots of approaches. And this is not a medical office. This is a general health and wellness and coaching.
Right.
And it's not a clinical model, but it's a model that essentially coaches and coaxes the person in a direction that may be helpful for them.
Yeah, we thrust agency upon you and teach you what you might want to do and give you best practices and then check back with you. We don't, give you the answer necessarily.
And it's probably a good idea to have an affiliated medical associate that can end up handling the findings that will obviously come up where you see a dramatic clinical abnormality in the EEG, which you can't call because it's not your, you don't have that bib on the hat, having a doc at your beck and call to handle cases like that is quite useful.
Yeah, we generally find we have to navigate coaching type things for a lot of people. And that may mean we're working with someone's neurologist and providing data, or we're working with someone's therapist, helping them look at an attention test. And even though we're not medical and we don't have that clinical perspective, that psychological clinical necessarily, legal and medical oversight, we do refer out to those sorts of things. If we see things that are unusual, or we think, I can't tell you the number of people that I send out to have their neck imaged in like a NUCA practice because they've had a car accident. If there's musculoskeletal things, I can't diagnose them for you, but I can say, oh, hey, I think you may be experiencing something that a provider in this landscape really needs to take a look at. Here's somebody, and we have those relationships in all of our physical offices. We have a few doctors, a few, specialists in each area. But yeah, it is something we manage. And one of the ways I've been able to get away from having to manage that is because people often find neurofeedback. It's a niche. So they often find it late in their experience of addressing their goals. So by the time I've gotten somebody with a severe trauma history or a lot of seizures or major autism, they have a deeply skilled relationship with this clinical stuff. And they know how their meds work, and they have their team, and they have, they're kind of over their talk therapy or not, or whatever. And it's just like you managing your own medication, PRN. People come in, and I'm okay to work with you if you have a clinical diagnosis, but I'm not the clinician for you. Yeah. So sometimes it's a little bit of like hey, there's a severity here. I think that you should probably see your doctor of this flavor. But
it's very similar to what I've been doing. And, I work with patients that have epilepsy, and I'm not a neurologist, so I can't treat epilepsy, but I can train somebody who has epilepsy how to operate their brain optimally and work with the neurologist or epileptologist who's managing their case, because I never work behind the scenes without their knowledge.
Right.
And at that point, the doctor's managing they're treating the seizures. I'm just teaching to optimize brain function. And when the seizures go away, and we've got good experience that that's what's going to happen, the meds will be pulled, because the doctor doesn't want you on meds if you're not having seizures.
Absolutely.
And you end up with seizure-free, medication-free. And we just published another case like that in Neuroregulation. The patient just graduated with honors from Baylor, and she wanted to be able to do lectures about intractable epilepsy and neurofeedback and life outcomes, and as a motivational speaker. And she wanted her case to actually be published. So Rusty Turner, myself, Sue Wilson, the treatment team basically ended up getting it written up in great detail. Medication seizure-free for like 7 years, and now she had a Division I tennis scholarship, 4 years, Dean's List, and now she's graduated and has this publication that just came out last month as a basically a validation of her clinical case story, basically.
Link to the show will be right here.
And it's Isabella is the patient's name, and her case was astounding. Actually had a little bit of neurofeedback in the U.S. before her family moved to Barcelona, where as a young preteen she started to have intractable seizures, and the EEG done in the United States actually showed the seizure activity in the temporal lobe. The neurologist and neurosurgeon in Barcelona wanted to remove her right temporal lobe to control the intractable epilepsy. They chose to do neurofeedback and quit meds, and they were told that would kill their daughter. And obviously she's bloomed really quite well. It's one thing to be seizure-free, med-free for 7 years. It's another thing to have graduated with honors on a tennis scholarship. So
that's amazing.
She didn't just escape epilepsy; she bloomed in a major way. An impressive young lady. So.
That's wonderful. Of course, I've seen some similar things across the decade or 22 years I've been doing neurofeedback. But in terms of medication management, that I find the same thing that happens. Antidepressants, anti-seizure meds, you sort of bring the floor up to meet the person, and then the meds take care of themselves with the doctor and the client. Great. I find I have to be a little bit more pointed with my advice with psychostimulants and people that use cannabis, because almost always somewhere around 3 to 5 weeks in, the tolerance to stimulants and the tolerance to cannabis gets abolished out of nowhere. And the person's like getting 3, 4, 5 times the subjective impact suddenly from those drugs. And it can get in the way and cause problems behaviorally or, psychologically. Like, oh my God, I can't get off the couch. I'm too stoned. Or my kid is super irritable, won't sleep or eat right now. Oh, maybe that Adderall is, they need a different dose now, essentially. So I sort of warn parents of kids that are taking stimulants, and I warn people that are, chronic stoners, like, well, look, a couple weeks in, you're probably going to start getting potentiated effects as you get more sensitive. So that's something you may have to manage. Maybe make an appointment with your doctor and, ask for a refill that's got extra amount of half the dose, or come up with a strategy for that drug, maybe, because in my experience, you're probably going to be very sensitive to these medications in a few weeks.
When your consciousness becomes clear, the effects of these things are notable. When you're all clouded, it's hard to spot these things, and as you clear people's consciousness, it's astounding how sensitive they can be to stuff that they just absolutely were oblivious to previously.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to try to get
if you look at the literature, SMR training, for instance, you can look at a visual event-related potential and look at the size of the potential that you're evoking and get an idea of how much recruitment the visual stimuli is getting. If you do SMR, the size of the visual stimulus jumps up. You've removed some somatosensory interference. And so as you control the inner level of noise, you can see signals that you couldn't see before. You can feel effects that were just part of the background cloud before, but now they're obvious.
And that's a plasticity effect too, right? There's there's the motor evoked potential work that shows that one session of SMR creates a much lower threshold of activation to create the hand jumping when you give the brain a little magnetic pulse, a certain threshold to activate that. But after a single session, the threshold's way reduced. So it's not just clearing information, it's making the system more sensitive, more plastic, more changeable, I think, in general. So,
Dr. Hill, Jay, is it true? I've heard that the stoners out there, the boozers out there, once they've done neurofeedback, some people have lost the taste for their drug of their choice. Is that true?
It is true. Not just alcohol and weed. People often, depending on what you're doing to the brain, people can lose the taste for cravings for sugar as well.
What the hell is happening? Why?
As you clear the brain, you don't need substances. We basically did a research project on 30 addicted individuals of a wide variety of different substances. But we found that there were two primary drive mechanisms towards addiction: overarousal, which had 3 EEG patterns, fast alpha, which is overarousal, low voltage fast, which is overarousal, and beta spindles, which are overarousal. If you had overarousal, alpha theta was part of your future as a therapeutic intervention. And the alpha theta people, when you get rid of the drive towards the substance and you're exposed to the substance, it's quite often something that you have a bad reaction to. There's no more reason. You've taken away the drive. In psychology, read the books. You get rid of the drive, you're supposed to get rid of the behavior associated with the drive, aren't you? Well, if you really get rid of the drive, that's what happens. The other third of the addicted population has anterior cingulate drive,
obsessive,
not an overarousal. They had an obsessive compulsive drive. And if you don't fix that, you end up with the symptom substitution. If they're clean and sober, they're going to find something else to be locked onto. But you can end up getting rid of the drive, and at that point, the behavior associated with the addiction goes away.
Yeah, the old rat park example, where when rat park is fun, the rats play in the park, but when rat park is empty, they just do cocaine all day instead.
Yeah,
So,
and to their detriment.
Yeah.
They'll do drugs until they die, and if you give them an enriched environment, they have a life, as opposed to just do the drugs.
I mean, that's true for the mechanisms: over arousal, impulsivity, obsessiveness. But I honestly think it's a lot simpler than that. Most addictive stuff is driven by learning. Neurofeedback changes learning, so you can shape the direction you go in and change your stuck patterns of reinforcement.
Yeah. Foundationally, the neuroplasticity principle is what allows you to get out of the drive mechanism that you're being driven towards something with. You're, after all, who's in control? Do we have strings coming up? Is there a master puppeteer up there, dangling us, controlling our behavior? No, we're autonomic, and we get to name ourselves. We're self-regulating, and
sometimes.
Well, even when we're not aware of what we're doing, we're still doing it ourselves.
Right. Even when involuntary, it's still self. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Andrew, and
you as well, Jay, of course.
And it's good to see a referral to Eran's lab turn out so obviously successful. So,
well, thank you. It was an amazing experience working with Dr. Zaidel, working with Dr. Johnstone, Jack. Going formal defeated me for a second. Doctors Zaidel and Johnstone and other folks that I got just a huge, rich, just as an aside, you mentioned when I first reached out that I was like, how do I get a degree in this without, getting laughed out of the interview process, essentially. And I found when I was interviewing for grad school, people were like rolling their eyes when the word biofeedback was brought up. But about 2-3 years into grad school, all these really, really senior scientists at different departments in UCLA were like, oh, you're the neurofeedback guy. Ooh, I have a cool test suite you might want to use in your research. So I think there's been a sea change of legitimacy as the tech space evolves. And I think that's giving not just scientists and clinicians more agency to learn and do, but individuals. It becomes much more approachable over time.
To a large extent, I think that's also been leveraged by international neuroscience, not having the pejorative associated with neurofeedback, but basically using neurofeedback as a manipulant. We brought in scientists from Salzburg, University of Salzburg, Flemish's lab, and their exposure to the concept of neurofeedback suddenly put neurofeedback into their experiments. You get people doing PhD dissertation work with neurofeedback as the tool that they're using. So the number of labs in Europe went from Tübingen basically being almost the only one to suddenly having Salzburg, and there's a Spanish society, there's an Italian society, there's a Society for Applied Neuroscience for Europe. England's got its own little group as well. I mean, it's flourished internationally, and don't even start to talk about it in Asia. I mean, goodness gracious, the Koreans have done fabulous work. A complete database, dry headset. They're doing AI scrubbing of the data to predict mild cognitive impairment and dementia. They've got a whole bunch of other discriminant features being built at this point with AI. So internationally, it's just exploded, and it's not like you have a pejorative against neurofeedback internationally at all. There's still a little hangover in the U.S. That I still have to apologize for the early hippie reputation. That was me, So our whole field was dismissed as a bunch of hippies, and that
well, you've redeemed yourself. I think you've
my apologies.
You've come a long way. So Yeah.
All we need is a few more podcasts out there. Get the word going. Drip, drip, drip. Dr. Andrew Hill, Jay Gunkelman, thank you for coming on the NeuroNoodle Podcast.
My pleasure, guys. Take care of those brains.
Oh, yes.
Bye-bye.
The NeuroNoodle Podcast is supported by listeners and businesses just like you. Like our gold supporter, the 7th Annual Super Brain Summit at Bradley University, and our silver supporter, Mind Media. Join us at the 7th Annual Super Brain Summit at Bradley University Center for Collaborative Brain Research. It's featuring speaker Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. She's the author of The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Our Love and Loss. If you want to get more information regarding registration, contact Gwen Hoarter. She's at GHOWARTER@bradley.edu or call her at 309-677-3900. If you want more information regarding programming, you can contact Dr. Lori Russell Chapin herself at 309-677-3186 or email lar@bradley.edu. Mindmedia.com. Get the latest EEG and neurofeedback technology from mindmedia.com. Their semi-dry sensor cap is a wonder to see, and their EEG amplifiers have been trusted in the field for decades. Their neurofeedback and QEEG courses will get you up to speed in no time. Visit mindmedia.com now.